today. The next slide has our agenda for today. We are in the introduction and logistics stage right now. I will tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. And from here, we will go into presentations from members of each of the working groups of the Maine Climate Council. You'll have about a 5-minute overview of each of those working groups, and then we'll share some opportunities for engagement in the process over the next couple of months, and give you some instructions about how to get into some breakout sessions so you can dive a little more deeply into 2 of the working groups. The technical notes for today, you are all muted right now. Many of you have already identified the chat function as a great way to ask questions and get responses. Also want to let you know, can you go, we're not quite up to that slide yet. So you can email Abigail Bradford with any questions. There we go, stop there, perfect. And just want to let you know that today's webinar is being recorded and the video will be shared by co-hosts later this afternoon. All right, next slide. Perfect. So a little bit of background on how we got here. After years of climate change denial from the Blaine House, Maine elected a climate champion in 2018. Climate was the first thing that Governor Janet Mills mentioned in her inaugural address, and it was more than just a talking point. Last year, Governor Mills introduced landmark legislation establishing the Maine Climate Council and charging that body with development of an ambitious climate action plan. Next slide. Maine now has a statutory requirement to reduce climate change emissions at least 80% over 1990 levels by 2050, with mandatory benchmarks to keep us on track, including carbon neutrality by 2045. Meeting these mandates will be an all-hands-on-deck endeavor, requiring transformative change from every corner of our state and every sector of our economy. Next slide. The Maine Climate Council is structured to bring representatives from those corners and sectors together. The council itself includes commissioners from all state agencies, representatives from business and industry, environmental, labor, public health, and community advocates, and more. In addition to the 39 members of the council itself, there are more than 200 Maine people serving on sector-specific working groups and the Science and Technical Subcommittee. These working groups are charged with developing recommendations that will help Maine meet those statutory emissions reductions and enhance the resilience of Maine communities. The recommendations will be delivered to the council in June, and you'll hear progress and updates on where they stand from members of the working groups today. Next slide. All right, when it comes to climate action, the what in terms of what we do isn't the only thing that matters. The how is vitally important too. And I'm really pleased to let all of you know that the community resilience and equity and diversity elements of our climate action plan are specifically called out in the legislation. So we aren't just looking at the mechanics and the logistics of emission reductions. We're really looking at building a stronger and more inclusive and equitable Maine. I am going to hand it over to my colleague David Costello from the Natural Resources Council of Maine to tell you a little bit more about the progress and the timeline for this work. David? Do we have David on the line?
David is having technical difficulties, so I think that we should circle back to this after we hear Jeff about the building's work.
Do you want me to walk through the timeline a little bit, or?
If you can, that'd be great.
All right, David, if you figure out how to interrupt me, please do. What you see here is the timeline of a very aggressive and rapid reaction here. So the Climate Council kicked off last fall. The working groups have been holding regular meetings. I believe that in the month of April, there were 30 working group meetings in 30 days. So we have been working hard, and many of you have participated and attended those meetings. The working groups will deliver their recommendations to the full Climate Council in a 2-day remote participation kind of meeting, June 17th and 18th. And we'll share information about how to participate in that when it's available. And then the summer will really include a pretty robust public education and input process. So again, as those details are available, we will share opportunities to weigh in and to let the council know what you think of the recommendations. There will be another full council meeting in September, and we'll definitely keep you posted on that. Additional public listening sessions. And then the big deadline is that the Climate Action Plan is due to the legislature on December 1st. Next slide. So the Climate Action Plan is really intended to lay out a bold path for Maine's climate future. And you see here a number of the goals that we are pursuing together. I think I'm gonna let David come back if he wants to say a little bit more about this. And is Jeff ready? Do we want to go to? All right. Jeff Marks is a senior policy advocate and Maine director of Acadia Center. He's also a member of the Buildings, Infrastructure, and Housing Working Group and is going to walk us through what that group is up to and what recommendations we can anticipate. Jeff?
Okay, well, I want to thank you twice, Kathleen. One, for running this webinar, and second, for being one of the co-chairs for the Buildings, Infrastructure, and Housing Working Group, along with Michael Stoddard with Efficiency Maine Trust. These working group chairs have done a tremendous job at really compiling a lot of information, bringing a lot of people together, and really moving this work forward, even during the challenging times that we have here. So thank you to the working group chairs as well as the members. So why are we here? Why are we focusing on this particular sector? Well, the transportation, buildings, and power sectors there's really the largest opportunities for greenhouse gas emission mitigation from these sectors. And Mike Williams will talk a little bit about transportation, and Greg on energy a little bit later. But this particular sector with buildings, infrastructure, and housing takes up really 39% of Maine's total greenhouse gas emissions. Now, the residential sector is second to transportation in the highest carbon emissions overall, second to transportation, which is 54%. Residential makes up about 19%. So that's the first reason we're looking at this particular sector. Second is, Maine has some of the oldest housing stock in the country. And as this slide mentions, 56% of Maine homes were built before 1980. So you can just imagine how leaky they are, how not well insulated they are. They probably have old heating systems in a lot of cases. So this sector is really ripe for opportunity in reducing emissions. And the third reason we're looking at this is Maine has one of the highest reliance on fossil fuels for their heating needs, with 61% of homes still heated with oil. And granted, that is better than about 5 or 6 years ago. I think it was up to about 75 or 80% heated with oil. So we've come a long way in the last decade, but we still have a ways to go. Next slide. So where are we going? Where does this working group want to get us? And I think if you read down through these are all very positive results that we'd like to see from the solutions that we put together as a working group and hopefully are adopted by the full Maine Climate Council in December. Of course, improved efficiency, and we want people to be comfortable in their homes and buildings. We want to work on building codes, and I'll get to that in a little bit, and make sure that buildings are net zero, renewable ready going forward in new construction. We want to make sure that the materials that we use are not only low global warming potential materials, but that we can tap into materials that have less embodied carbon in them. Steel and cement, really long lifetime carbon content in those, but we happen to be a 90% forested state. Why not tap into wood to build our buildings going forward? As I mentioned before, we want to get off fossil fuels as much as possible and go over to clean heating and cooling systems. Of course, we all want reduced energy costs for running our homes and buildings. And we want our industries to be cleaner as well. Next slide. So who is the working group? I used to work for a large technology company, and we used to approach buildings in a systems way. We wanted to get all the systems in the buildings like heating, ventilation, air conditioning, lighting, security, fire suppression, motors, electricity, all working together to give the best efficiency for those buildings. And that's what this working group is doing. It's different people, different components, very diverse views who have come together to get us to the highest efficiency possible in the buildings policies that we put forward as a working group. So very proud to be sitting along with some real experts in these areas, architects, engineers, the folks from Efficiency Maine, towns and cities, utilities, members of our youth community, and many, many more who are working on this working group and outside the working group to provide recommendations going forward. Next slide. So as a working group, these are 6 strategies that we're looking at, and I'll go through these really quickly for time's sake, but we can get into some of the details during the breakout sessions later. First, we want to tackle new buildings and make sure that the buildings that we build today that will be around for decades are the most energy efficient that they can be. So we want to establish steadily increasing residential and commercial building codes, and we want to make sure that everybody is complying with those codes going forward. So that's the first strategy. Strategy number 2 is making sure that we transition to cleaner heating and cooling. The big focus now is electrifying our homes and buildings. Heat pumps are energy efficient, they're effective in cold weather, they're cost effective, and when you add heat pumps with weatherization and even solar PV, you have a really tight energy efficiency house or building. So we're working on policies there. Number 3, we talked about new buildings, but we also want to tackle the existing building envelopes. Just like the real estate adage, location, 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 this strategy is all about weatherize, weatherize, weatherize. Make sure that we are doing energy audits and energy retrofits and making all houses, including affordable housing, more energy efficient and cost effective. Number 4, lead by example in publicly funded buildings. You know, if the state itself isn't making its buildings energy efficiency, why should the market follow with energy efficiency buildings there? So we want to make sure that we're following best practices for materials and systems in state buildings, including affordable housing, schools, and government buildings. The 5th strategy is decarbonization of industrial processes. Efficiency Maine right now has very good programs to increase energy efficiency in our large companies and industrial facilities. But that funding is limited. So we may need to look at other sources of funding to help really up the game for industrial facilities in Maine. And last and not least, we want to modernize and stabilize the electric grid. If we're looking to decarbonize our electricity system, if we're looking to use beneficial electrification and within our houses and buildings, and if we're looking to really increase the number of electric vehicles and charging stations and cleaner transportation in the state, this is all going to mean more electricity and new demand on the electricity grid. So we're going to have to kind of combine all of these strategies, our new building strategies, our existing buildings, our heating and cooling systems, our industrial processes, tie all these together in an electricity grid that works for the state and works for ratepayers and consumers in the state. So I think I'm over my 5-minute limit, and I'll turn it back over to you, David.
Thanks a lot, Jeff. Next up is the Transportation Working Group, and it's Mike Williams, who's the Deputy Director at the Blue Green Alliance. Go ahead, Mike.
Thanks, David. So as David mentioned, I am Mike Williams. I'm with the Blue Green Alliance. Those of you who don't know, we're a national partnership of labor unions and environmental organizations. We do a lot of our work federally, but also in states across the country, specifically trying to land on those aligned solutions that lift up working people while also taking on the climate crisis. And so I'm here in Maine, and I have lucky enough to have built relationships not just with the environmental movement up here, but also with the labor movement, with unions up here. And I was asked by the folks from the Maine AFL-CIO to sit on the Transportation Working Group, which I sincerely appreciate. And in addition, there's folks from labor on the Buildings Working Group and the Energy Working Group, and there's a big focus for us is specifically on supporting the workforce. And so I wanted to just start with that and note that that's where I'm coming from personally, but also very supportive of trying to really lean into these working groups and specifically transportation to drive down emissions, but also creating high quality jobs for Mainers at the same time. Could you go to the next slide? So why transportation? Honestly, this is where most of our emissions are. More than half of the state's total emissions come from transportation, and it's because we drive quite a lot. We're a rural state, and we have a lot of tourists, and it's where we get a lot of our pollution, and it's something that is kind of hard to unstick. The rural and suburban driving do make up the majority of this problem. So I think rural and suburban drivers drive roughly 45% more than urban drivers. And so it's something that we need to take a look at and try to figure out how we can solve that problem. And it's not as though it's getting better, it's actually getting worse. There's been an increase in total transportation emissions across the whole state, but specifically a big one in the Portland metro area. And then not just across the board, but also a per capita increase. So we're seeing person by person, more driving, more emissions coming from folks. Although with the current coronavirus crisis, there's obviously a significant change in that. And so we've been utilizing that information and understanding that to see how things like teleworking can come into play. But I'll get to that in just a moment. The next slide, please. So what vision are we looking at from the Transportation Working Group and then from all of my colleagues, especially from the environmental movement here? Basically, if we can boil it down, we've got 5 nice bullet points here, which I can read through, but it comes down to less driving and lower emission driving, or no emission driving, preferably. And that's where all of this comes from. I should say less driving or no driving, or lower emission or no emission driving. So these bullets of clean, safe, and affordable transportation options for all Mainers, whether you're rural, whether you're low income, whether you're in York County or Aroostook County. Getting good transportation options is incredibly important. Noting that we're a rural state, that driving is going to be part of our livelihood, really ramping up an increase in electric vehicles and public transit also in rural areas, but specifically electric vehicles, and making it so that it's affordable and available for all Mainers. And then in addition, building out the infrastructure that we need that goes along with those. The infrastructure is also the big place of where we can create a lot of high quality jobs. Next slide, please. So this is who our working group is. You're people who dig into the specifics and the nitty gritty on transportation, advocates from low-income communities, low-income organizations, the Contractors Association, the builders, environmental organizations, organized labor, public sector, so on and so forth. Pretty diverse group, and I will say it can be pretty complicated. There's been some disagreement and sometimes discord, but generally it's been pretty amicable. But it's really important to have all of these voices included in here. And surprisingly enough, while there has been difficulties and disagreement, there is a lot of agreement. In fact, the vast majority of the strategies, which we'll see on the next slide, have significant agreement across this very diverse array of folks. So we can go to the next slide. So here are the 5 strategies that the working group is leaning into and is probably going to, not probably, almost definitely going to be submitting to the Climate Council in a week or a couple of weeks or so. And so we'll go through each of these. So reflect the true cost of driving, reduce vehicle miles traveled, expand electrification of vehicles, increase fuel economy, and adapt Maine's critical infrastructure. And so that first one has actually been the most complicated. So I'll spend just a moment on talking about what that means. So the true cost of driving, what driving does in terms of impacting our pollution portfolio, what it does in terms of impacting our state's infrastructure, and really figuring out how we build those costs into the issue of driving. And so there's a lot of ways to do this. We already pay a cost for driving, whether it's the personal cost of owning a vehicle or leasing a vehicle. We already pay a gas tax. Gas tax is actually quite a bit lower in Maine and in the US than it is in a lot of other places in the world. And it doesn't properly at all cover the costs to take care of our state's infrastructure needs. We also, it should be noted, when we compare per capita cost or spending on issues like public transportation, we are at the lowest. We spend so little on that. And I think it's because we don't have the amount of revenue that we need. So this has really been digging into that issue of how do we capture that cost of driving, raise revenue so that we can fix this issue. And so there's been a number of ideas put out and discussed. Fuel tax, so that's effectively your gas tax or different constructs. A low carbon fuel standard that's a more complicated issue that we can get into in the breakout group. And then the Transportation and Climate Initiative, which is really a interesting and innovative effort that's a regional effort similar to the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which focus on the electricity sector. TCI is focused on transportation. It's about raising those revenues from fuel sources, fuel importers and such, and then allocating that revenue to solutions to expand and enhance access to clean transportation options, with a significant focus on supporting Maine workers, supporting Maine's rural areas, and folks from low-income communities. It's something that's a really interesting idea that could really benefit Maine. We would need to work out the details to make sure that it is equitable and that it really is supporting Maine workers, but it's something that we've been pushing forward. I will say that there has been consternation with some folks, contractors and a few others who have questions about that and are a little bit concerned. So we are working through it, and it probably will be mentioned in the recommendations, but I wanted to spend a few extra moments just to talk about that piece there. Quickly though, the other 4 strategies, I will say, there's pretty wide agreement. So the second one, reduce vehicle miles traveled, we're all experiencing what that could look like if telework and teleservices were much more widely available. And I feel like all of us are getting a crash course in how that could work. It's turning out that it is lowering our emissions dramatically. This is a horrible way to do it. But it's something where we could learn these lessons and try to incorporate this into our day-to-day life. And so this is going to be something that we are recommending to the Climate Council that telework, teleservice, and such are incorporated into this, along with greatly improving and expanding public transit, getting more rail options, more bus options, and then also incorporating smart growth into our planning. The next big one, I would say, is a statewide electric vehicle roadmap. And it's a way so that the state can plan and put forward a plan that really expands the usage of electric vehicles in the state, and so that it's available for all Mainers of all incomes, all regions, so on and so forth. This is really important. So I'm coming down to the end of my time. There's a few other options. You can see them here: increasing the state's fuel economy, and then really rebuilding and adapting Maine's critical infrastructure. I talked a lot about lowering emissions, but it's also something the other part of dealing with the climate crisis is adaptation, or being resilient in the face of a changing climate and the impacts that come from it. We gave a lot of thought to that, creating an assessment and action plan. So that's also part of it. So I look forward to your questions and in the breakout group, but otherwise I'll pass it back to David.
Thanks, Mike. Next up, we have the Energy Working Group discussion, and it's led by Greg Cunningham. Greg's the Vice President Director of Clean Energy and Climate at the Conservation Law Foundation. Go ahead, Greg.
Thank you, David. Hi, folks. My name is Greg Cunningham. As David mentioned, I'm with the Conservation Law Foundation, which is a New England-based regional environmental organization. And I'm a member of the Energy Working Group, which is largely focused on the electric sector and energy fuels. Next slide, please. So why are we focusing on the energy sector? Maine has actually done a really good job of reducing greenhouse gas emissions from its electricity sector, particularly relative to other states. However, to the extent that we are going to, as Jeff alluded to, electrify the way in which we operate our cars, the way in which we heat our buildings, we're going to have to shift even further from polluting fossil fuels to electricity that is derived from clean, renewable resources. And so we need to plan for that future. You know, how we get enough clean, renewable resources on our grid and ensure that our grid can handle them will require some incentives. Now, these aren't handouts necessarily. Many of these can be market-based incentives where we're actually driving the Maine economy while ensuring that more clean energy is developed and produced, and therefore our emissions are declining, and they're declining on a scale as required by Maine law. The electric system, obviously today, is designed for a different way of doing things. We've got generally large power plants in localities that deliver vast amounts of energy onto the system. The vision of the future is, you know, we're going to diversify our electricity supply. We're going to distribute it over the entire state. And the electric system is going to have to change to meet those needs. So we need to plan for that as well. We're also here focusing on this because this transformation really has to benefit all Mainers and all businesses in Maine. And that has to be a thoughtful process. We need to do this quickly because the risks of climate change are massive, but we need to do it in a way that's equitable and that takes into consideration the needs, costs, concerns of all Mainers and businesses. Next slide, please. So what's our vision for Maine's energy system? Today, Maine exports about $5 billion a year in dirty fuels, dirty energy. So there's a lot of capital out there that, if directed in the proper way, could go a long way toward meeting our clean energy goals. So our vision is we shift that money toward local investments in clean energy. And there are lots of opportunities there, whether it's energy efficiency, renewables like solar and wind, or storage opportunities, as well as opportunities in transportation and buildings with heat pumps and electric vehicle charging stations along our highways. So that's a major part of our vision. Similarly, we need to redesign our electric system, as I alluded to a moment ago, in a way that, you know, for example, charges us for electricity in manners that give us incentives to use electricity in different ways and at different times of days. And also in a way that ensures that we're using that electricity in a climate-friendly manner. We also have to modify the system to accommodate this new way of doing business in a carbon-free environment. And to do so will require planning. Finally, this clean energy shift has to create more jobs. This is about the climate, but it's going to be an economy driver. It's going to clean our air, and it's going to be good for all Mainers. Next slide, please. So the energy working group, as with the other working groups, was very carefully selected by the governor's energy office and the governor's office herself. And it is a diverse group. It's representative of the many interests in Maine. I've listed only a few here. Others that I've not included include labor, low-income advocates. We have a number of young people who are bringing ideas to the table that some of us who've been involved in this for a long time haven't considered. And it's a really refreshing perspective. And that includes various college students from within Maine. We've got professionals who specialize in this area, like economists, various lawyers, and of course, many businesses who will be impacted by this transformation are involved, and they're representing not only their own interests, but the broader interests of the Maine business community. So it's well represented, and we've disagreed at least as much as we've agreed on a lot of issues, and I think that's where the best compromises arise, and we're doing our best in that regard. Next slide, please. So where have we landed? And I'll run through these very quickly, and we can elaborate if you're interested in joining the energy working group pullout group. But the short of it is, this first bullet refers to a power sector transformation. It's really a public process in which we try to forecast and predict what our future looks like if we're decarbonizing, if we're removing carbon from our economy. How many electric vehicles do we need to shift to? What does public transportation look like? How are we heating our homes? And do those have impacts on our electricity system, for example? If it does, over what period of time will an increased demand in electricity occur? And how do we plan for that? What new infrastructure do we need to put in place? What additional individual and business behaviors do we need to influence with policies and financial incentives? That's what this planning process involving the power sector transformation would involve. And it's all designed to ensure that we can achieve the objectives and recommendations that the Maine Climate Council ultimately puts out. It's likely to be a public process at first, but we expect that there will be later proceedings at the Public Utilities Commission and other agencies where we implement those various policies. Second here is how we ensure that we build out enough clean energy in the future. Maine's got some excellent policies on the books that were passed very recently that really are going to drive clean energy in Maine, but we need to take into consideration what more we need to do. And should that include very specific technologies such as offshore wind, where we've got a massive resource here in the Gulf of Maine. The third bullet and recommendation relates to financing of all of this work. It can be difficult to obtain private financing from your typical bank for, say, solar panels on your house. And it can be even more challenging for a larger project. So our group is contemplating a financing entity that can not only spur and provide incentives for this kind of clean energy development, but most importantly, bring private capital into that as well. So they match capital, for example, and sometimes it's 3 times the amount of private capital for 1 part green bank capital. But the effect is it's both building out new clean energy, but more importantly, driving the economy as well. The final recommendation relates to our heating fuels, and it's a way to, our heating fuels obviously are a significant contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, and we're going to need to substantially if not eliminate them, substantially reduce them. But that's going to take time. And in order to do that equitably, we're going to need to make use of some of those fuels for some period of time. A renewable fuel standard provides an opportunity for us to reduce the amount of carbon in those fuels and reduce emissions from them as a result. And it provides incentives for the industry to reduce those the carbon content within their fuels. So we're exploring that as well. All of these are currently in the consideration phase. These are not final. We have got a meeting this afternoon, in fact, in which we're hoping to reach a solid consensus. But this gives you a pretty good sense for where we are. Thank you, David. Back to you.
Great, thank you, Greg. Next we have Ivy Frinoka, who's the Casco Bay keeper for the Friends of Casco Bay. Ivy, go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ivy Frinoka, and I am the Casco Bay keeper with Friends of Casco Bay. My organization's mission is to improve and protect the Bay, and as Bay keeper, I am our lead advocate. In listening to the presentations and seeing all the questions in chat, I just want to remind people there'll be 2 breakout sessions later, so you can ask questions, and there's also a portal through the Maine Council website where you can put in your thoughts and recommendations to the council based on what you learned today. So I'm a member of the Coastal and Marine Working Group. That group has just over 30 people in it, and like the other groups, it has a very diverse membership. We represent the coastal and marine sector, so there's a lot of businesses represented, including hospitality, marinas, ports, fisheries, and aquaculture, and there's a lot of scientists, economists, and people who study the social sciences. There's also a lot of people who spend a lot of time managing, protecting, and planning for conserving our coastal and marine resources. When we began our work, we realized, and apropos of the presentations you've just heard, that many of the mitigation solutions, what's needed to reduce our carbon footprint, are going to occur in other sectors, particularly transportation. And that in the coastal and marine environment, we would have to do our part to contribute to mitigation solutions, but that we really had to look at how we were going to adapt to all the changes that are occurring, shifting fisheries and increased storm intensities and storm surge and ocean acidification. Next slide, please.
Excuse me, Ivy, if you can hear me, can you get closer to your microphone? A lot of people are having trouble hearing you.
You're muted now, Ivy.
Okay, I went on mute to adjust the volume. Can you hear me better now?
Keep talking. You froze.
Can you hear me?
Yes, much better.
Okay, I took off my headset, so hopefully there will be no background noise. So sorry for those of you who missed the introduction. Basically, just to recap, what I was saying is in the when we began our work, we recognized that a lot of the really big mitigation efforts that Maine would need to take were going to be covered by other sectors. For example, by transportation. And that in the coastal and marine environment, we would need to do our part to help with mitigation solutions, but that what we really had to do was make recommendations for resiliency and adaptation because there's so many impacts being felt in the coastal and marine environment. This includes things like sea level rise, shift in species, and so forth. So we looked at developing recommendations that built on a lot of what's going on in the public and private sector already, but consolidating and complementing those efforts and taking them to the next level. So our first recommendation is that Maine needs a very coordinated system to track ocean climate change. We have a lot of data already, but it's not collected in a coordinated way, and often it's collected when funding is available. So when funding runs out, the research stops. And it's important to track ocean climate change, both because there's still aspects of it that we don't understand, and because we need to be able to develop models so we can predict consequences in the future for purposes of planning. So this recommendation isn't about answering purely scientific questions. It is to provide a foundation for action, and all of our other recommendations flow from tracking climate change. The way we'll disseminate that is through information exchange, and that would be a state-managed database, probably broken down by region because the coast of Maine is so vast and varied, and it would include briefing for legislators, symposia for targeted audiences, and so forth. Next slide. Complementary to the information exchange would be creation of a marine business council. This would be specific to fisheries and aquaculture, so that targeted information could be provided to wild harvesters and aquacultures, and you could work collaboratively to test pilot mitigation and adaptation strategies. And this council would also look at identifying funding sources for that work. The corollary to that is really taking a look at how we're doing fisheries management on a municipal, state, and regional level to make changes so that it's easier to do the resiliency strategies we need, and we look at managing fisheries in a way that is commensurate with climate change. So maybe going from management. Next slide, please. The next set of recommendations we made, can you all still hear me?
You're good now. I turned off your video, Ivy, to help with your connection.
Okay, is that we revise the laws and really look at requirements for planning for climate resiliency. So the rather specific are to protect certain habitats and to also help reduce the consequences of increased stormwater pollution and nutrient loading secondary to climate change. And the planning is to help identify natural solutions and steps that can be taken to make our coastline more climate resilient, especially from storm intensities and sea level rise. Next slide, please. And our final strategy is to look at using our blue carbon for mitigation. So Maine's coastal and marine plants, including salt marshes and eelgrass and seaweeds, have great capacity to store carbon if they're healthy. And if they're healthy, they can be a big part of the solution to capture carbon and help us meet our target reductions. If they're not healthy, then they're going to degrade and release part of the problem. And the added benefit of keeping our coastal ecosystems healthy is that it provides habitat and helps us be resilient into the future. So that's a very high level overview of very detailed recommendations. There'll be 2 breakout sessions. For those of you who want to learn more about this, the Coastal and Marine Working Group is meeting tomorrow, and you can sign up to observe that meeting and to participate and ask questions through the main page. And at the meeting tomorrow, we are reviewing the results of a poll that we sent out to hundreds of people about our draft strategies, seeking feedback, and we're going to work to sharpen these. So that's a great way to participate. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ivy. Next, we have Rebecca Boulos, and she's focused on, she's a member of the Community Resilience Planning, Public Health and Emergency Management Working Group. Becca, go ahead.
Thank you, David. Hi, everyone. Like he said, my name is Becca Boulos, and I'm Executive Director of the Maine Public Health Association, and I co-chair the Community Resilience Planning, Public Health and Emergency Management Working Group, the longest name, with Judy East from the Land Use Planning Commission and Annie Fuchs from Maine Emergency Management Agency. And our working group is the largest with about 45 members. And as such, we have a diversity of training and expertise among our membership. And so we divided ourselves into 3 subgroups, community resilient planning, public health, and emergency management. And I serve as co-chair of the public health subgroup. Next slide, please. So we know that climate changes health, and we know that these changes disproportionately impact vulnerable communities and populations in a negative way. And so within our working group, and in consideration of the efforts of other working groups, we conducted a comprehensive review of Maine's laws to achieve resilience. We identified opportunities to provide municipalities with technical assistance as they adapt to climate-related changes in their communities. We assembled a wide variety of different funding mechanisms, and we identified strategies for improving public health surveillance, monitoring, and education, and health systems, emissions, and preparedness. Next slide, please. So our vision for Maine communities is that they have the resources they need to prepare for and adapt to climate change, including funding, technical assistance, surveillance and monitoring, and that these resources are distributed equitably and locally across the state, and that public health effects and solutions to climate change are considered in decision-making at the municipal, regional, and state levels. Next slide, please. So as I said before, we have a large and diverse membership on our working group. You see some examples here. We have folks from local and state health departments, state veterinarian, we have planners and various community members. We have public health advocates and researchers. We have membership from Wabanaki Public Health, nonprofits from across the state. So it's a wide range of people that work in public health in different capacities. Next slide, please. So mirroring our diverse and sizable membership, and again with consideration of other working group efforts that impact these different areas that we were focused on, our working group is putting forward a total of 7 strategies to the Maine Climate Council. And so in context of today's presentation, I'll focus on these ones that you see here, as they are strategies that have the potential to reduce emissions and enhance resilience at the community level. So for community resilience planning, the strategies are to conduct a comprehensive review and revision of several Maine statutes and their associated regulations that are integral to supporting municipal, regional, and state level adaptation and resilience. As you can imagine, there's a lot in there, so there's a lot of opportunity. So just some examples of what that would be could include updating comprehensive planning and shoreland zoning, establishing a sea level resilience overlay zone, and expanding the utilization of floodplain management model ordinances, incentives, and assistance. Another strategy from community resilience planning is to improve the regional delivery system of technical assistance on resilience to municipalities. And the last one is the exploration and adoption of different funding mechanisms that support community resilience planning. And an example of that could include the establishment of cabinet-level coordination across state agencies so that funding priorities are consistent and can reach communities and regional organizations who are ready to implement adaptation solutions. For public health, our subgroup had a total of 4 strategy recommendations, but for today's discussion, I'll highlight 3 that you see there. The first is an increased investment in state and local surveillance and monitoring systems, including air quality monitoring and public education about climate change and available resources. The second is helping private homeowners, businesses, and municipalities prepare for high-intensity weather events, such as through source water protection ordinances and the use of low-impact development strategies. And the third is incentivizing carbon neutrality and preparedness planning among Maine's 4 largest health systems, recognizing that the healthcare sector accounts for nearly 1/10 of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. And lastly, for emergency management, the strategy is to develop and implement a non-disaster related state infrastructure climate adaptation fund, a lot of words there, that would allow municipalities and state agencies to access the funds they need to supplement the often excessive local cost shares associated with adaptation projects. So this funding strategy has been used in 13 other states, and they serve as a guide for what Maine's could look like. And data from the National Institute of Building Sciences suggests that for every $1 invested in disaster mitigation results in $6 of avoided disaster damages. So again, going back to our vision and our recognition that climate impacts adversely impact vulnerable communities, the idea behind this would be to have funding available for communities prior to a disaster instead of just in response to. So I'll just end this section by acknowledging the incredible work that has been conducted by our working group members, and I want to thank everyone who's on here today that's been participating and providing feedback as we've progressed over the past several months. So thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Becca. Next and last, the last working group representative, we have Eliza Donahue, who is the Staff Director of Advocacy and Staff Fraternity at Maine Audubon. Eliza?
Thanks, David. Hello, everyone. Like David said, I'm Eliza Donahue. I'm the Director of Advocacy at Maine Audubon. For those who are not familiar with the organization, we are a statewide wildlife and wildlife habitat conservation organization. So I'm a member of the Natural and Working Lands Working Group. Thanks so much, before I begin, for your interest and engagement in this important work. I'm really impressed with the number of people that are with us today. Slide. So why natural and working lands? Well, nature can play a big role in combating climate change. Plants and soil contain a lot of carbon. Globally, plants and trees store as much carbon as there is in the atmosphere, and soil contains 4 times as much carbon as there is in the atmosphere. To put a finer Maine focus point on it, 75% of Maine's fossil fuel emissions are currently offset by our forests and wood products, and there's a lot of potential for more. So we can fight climate change by reducing carbon emissions from our natural and working lands, and by storing carbon in the landscape. And the good news about that is that the co-benefits are often just as important as the emissions benefits. For instance, climate-friendly agricultural management increases soil productivity, conserved coastal wetlands protect against storm surges, and landscape-scale conservation keeps forests in production while maintaining critical wildlife habitat. And what's great about what's commonly referred to as natural climate solutions is that they're often affordable and immediately implementable. That means that these strategies can help us bridge the gap as we transition to no carbon energy sources. Slide. The Natural and Working Lands Working Group is diverse, but has perhaps surprisingly similar goals, from large landowners to entomologists, environmental advocates, farm owners, and natural resource agency staff. There's a pretty wide mix. Slide. The strategies to achieve our shared vision often overlap, such as adopting smart growth principles can keep farms working and keep development out of ecologically significant areas. Conserving connected landscapes can help support our forest products industry, and all of this can help us maintain and increase stored carbon. Slide. The working groups is still in the midst of finalizing our recommendations to the Climate Council, but there are a few that show the most promise, and I'll talk really briefly about 2. So first, Maine needs to create a dedicated, sustained public funding source to conserve working forest, agriculture, and ecologically significant lands. Maine's got a great history of supporting land conservation, but funding has been inconsistent, leaving us unable to match existing federal and private dollars, and sometimes unable to think long-term about strategic land acquisitions that'll get us the most climate benefit bang for our buck. I think we can do better, and I think Maine people really want to do better, particularly because these same lands support our vital forest products, outdoor recreation, and tourism economies. But it's not just about conserving big chunks of land. We've also got to incentivize private particularly small landowners, to both keep their lands in production, whether that be in ag or in forestry, but to also manage those lands with carbon storage and climate resiliency in mind. So that's two. I think I'd like to also say that, you know, as a wildlife and wildlife habitat advocate, I really love that the strategies we're discussing have a lot of wildlife benefits, and not just because developing strategies for climate adaptation is part of the Climate Council's charge, but because what will get us to our climate goals will also benefit wildlife. Managing for bigger, older trees results in more stored carbon as well as prime wildlife habitat. Having more trees, period, and keeping the ones that we've got means that wildlife can move across the state as they adapt to increased temperatures, and the list goes on. I encourage folks to continue to follow the Climate Council's work and to keep on the lookout for the co-benefits that are particularly meaningful to you. I think we all stand to gain something we didn't really expect from this work. Thank you, and I look forward to answering more questions in the breakout session.
Thank you, Eliza. Abby?
Hey everyone, my name is Abby Bradford. I am Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance's Outreach Manager. In a moment, we're going to transition into Q&A sessions on each of the working groups, and we'll give you instructions on how to do that. But first, after hearing all of these presentations, if you're wanting to get involved in the Maine Climate Council process, we encourage you all to join their public meeting on July 17th and 18th from 9 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. on both days. There's not a registration page for that event yet, but whichever group you signed up for today's webinar through will reach back out when one becomes available. You can also take action sooner than that by signing our petition calling for a strong and equitable climate action plan for Maine, and that will be emailed out to you by whichever group you signed up through today or tomorrow. And that email will also include a video recording of today's event and a quick survey. We would love to hear your feedback, your thoughts on both today's event and the Maine Climate Council itself. Okay, let's get you all into your working group. You can ask questions. I know many of you have been sending them through this chat. When you join the new session, you will have to resend them in that Zoom. Apologies.